So the global economy has lost and found about $6 trillion within the span of a week. The most intense global trade war in modern history has been threatened and then paused and then threatened and then paused and then threatened and then paused again. 7 different times now. By the time you are watching this video, that number might have been changed again. Global economic...
So if $6 trillion can be eliminated and found in the global economy in the span of a week, is it actually even real? Like, if we get to the point of, okay, your stock portfolio says you have this much money, but it's not realized, then it's not real money yet. At least it's not your money yet. So maybe we're accounting things improperly. But also from the trade war and tariff perspective, a lot of the reactions in the stock market have been because people were thinking that Trump wouldn't actually go through with it. And I think that's just poor risk management. If the president says he's going to do something, you should probably price that into your expectations and say, okay, he's probably going to do it. That way you're planning for the worst case scenario and you act accordingly. Yeah, sure. If you're investing and you plan accordingly, you might not make as much money as people that are assuming that it is speculative and not actually going to go through, but it's all dependent upon your risk tolerance and your risk capacity. A lot of the younger generation have the risk capacity to say, hey, this is speculative. But a lot of the older generations that are on the brink of retirement, they don't have that risk capacity. So they should probably plan accordingly and assume the worst case scenario.
Uncertainty is at record highs, and while the stock market may have recovered, for now, real people are starting to feel the consequences of this little game.
Also, from that standpoint, a lot of the reaction in the stock market to regain that $6 trillion is because the 90-day pause on tariffs. Well, let's assume that it is just a 90-day pause and Trump goes through with the tariffs again. There's going to be as bad, if not worse, reaction to the tariffs again. So if you plan accordingly, you can say, okay, maybe I'm a little bit bullish on the stock market right now until the tariffs come back up, and I'm going to convert to cash as the tariff policy starts again.
As layoffs are accelerated, hiring is frozen, prices are increasing, and interest rates are spiking.
Notice how he says hiring is frozen. Hiring is definitely frozen. Sure, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is reporting that the job market is in balance. We're seeing about as much layoffs as we are hires. That's why the unemployment rate remains unchanged. But if we look at the underemployment rate, underemployment is way higher than the government is paying attention to. So the labor market is not in balance. But Jerome Powell also just recently said that they're probably going to abandon the dual mandate in terms of fear of actual inflation. Well, when you think about it, the fear of inflation, if you are overly restrictive on the economy out of fears of inflation, you're going to potentially risk recession. And it's honestly, I personally think it's the wrong decision. Jerome Powell should be more concerned about the labor market deteriorating because it is not in as good of a condition as he leads on to. I think he knows this, but he just doesn't care. He's not going to cave into Trump because Trump wants interest rates to be lowered.
Now, I already know what you are thinking. There is nothing about these trade wars that hasn't been said already, and that's actually exactly the problem. For a variety of reasons, even highly respectable outlets and experts have been trying to find what the real meaning is behind the flip-flop trade war. Be it a secret plan to reduce interest rates before we refinance our debt, redefining the role of the US dollar as a global reserve, or just some 4D Uno negotiating tactic. These explanations are very entertaining and appealing to people who want to make sense of a situation that could really impact their personal financial situation. But if you want to look for deeper meaning where there is none, you should have majored in art history, not gone into journalism, economics, or business. Sometimes bad ideas are just bad ideas.
Yeah, the flip-flopping is definitely a bad idea because it just creates uncertainty, which is not good for the market. The market is going to react positively, even if it's bad news, but they know the bad news is coming. It's going to price that into the market and roll with it. The uncertainty is what's killing the market and causing all of this volatility.
And not acknowledging this has caused problems in politics and business well before we started putting tariffs on penguins.
President Trump's Commerce Secretary says the Commander-in-Chief plans to go ahead with his reciprocal tariff.
Today, Trump defended the tariff, saying that he thinks they'll make the country stronger.
The president needs to reset global trade.
Somebody had to do what we did, and I did a 90-day pause for the people that didn't retaliate. And that's what I did with China, because they did retaliate.
And one of the things here is, yeah, Trump's policy is an effort to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And if you look at it since the 2008 recession, the labor force participation rate has still not recovered. And so we're kind of just in a house of cards, and Trump is kind of toppling that house of cards.
We have our mission, our main thing that we do is curate and create culture.
You're never going to see as much volume and as many trades on the day with the biggest move.
They need our markets, they need our consumers, and they need this president in the Oval Office to talk to them. And that's exactly why more than 75.
What's going to happen with the market, I can't tell you, but I can tell you our country has gotten a lot stronger.
And a lot of American consumers relies on these cheap Chinese goods or cheap goods produced in India or elsewhere in the world. The reason they're so cheap is because they're basically being produced on slave labor.
Now, I want to make it clear that it doesn't matter, or at the very least it shouldn't matter, if you personally love or hate this administration, the businesses we are going to talk about, or even your own boss. Bad ideas are just bad ideas, right? Well, of course not. But bad ideas are some of the best opportunities to get ahead, as long as you know how to use them. So,
Exactly what I was saying at the beginning. If you can know how to manage risk appropriately, bad ideas can still end up with you coming out on top, as long as you manage risk properly.
May as well use this whole manufactured crisis as a learning opportunity. Something that you should be personally aware of is that if you move up in the corporate ladder or start to have any kind of success in business, is that it's going to be much easier to find people who agree with anything you say. The trope of the yes man exists for a reason.
Yeah, it's typically always an appeal to authority. That's how you see all of these businesses running with a enshittification business plan where they just start charging more for things that were free before or getting overly monetized. The video game industry is an excellent example of this. Live service games and, Concord flopped because it was overly monetized, and, Sony's continuing to kind of push the monetization game, and every video game company wants the next big live service game because you have whales that continue to just pay and produce profits for you. But a lot of the video game industry and video game consumers are sick and tired of it. And that's how you see video game companies that understand what they're trying to sell is a good single player game that isn't overly monetized. Those games do really well because there's a gap in the current market for it.
I see it all now. You're just a bunch of yes men. I was making the wrong moves and you were too gutless to tell me. Isn't that right? Yes.
Yes, sir. That answer.
Now, beyond the obvious problem of subordinates not wanting to clash with people that pay their salaries, or business leaders not wanting to insult the government that regulates them, there are three other, far more subtle, but equally effective ways that bad ideas get so much support. The first problem is that common sense is really hard to sell. If you have been paying attention to the news surrounding the trade wars, the Department of Government Efficiency, or even just regular run-of-the-mill corporate incompetence, you might have noticed that there is an almost endless supply of news and commentary claiming that even bizarre ideas actually kind of make sense. Now, some of this is just biased media reporting, nothing new there, but a lot of it is just people desperate to stand out in the marketplace of ideas. Our dumb little monkey brains love to see order and chaos, so the message that something that seems extremely scary is actually just part of a greater plan has been a great sales tactic for, well, all of human history.
Yeah, and the conversation about having your brain come up with order in the chaos, that's why random number generators, they're actually an algorithm, because truly random number generators seem to create patterns that people are like, this can't be a random number generator. There's too much pattern in it. Because we psychologically find a pattern even though there isn't one.
My friend Dr. Yuri Shasfort, who runs the channel Money and Macro, made a video last week breaking down the rationale behind resetting the global trade order. That video got a lot of attention because it looked like it was a defense of something that across the board has been pretty unpopular. Now, that video was actually a breakdown of the economic thinking that the administration is probably working off of, explained from the perspective of a real academic economist. But it was also one of his most viewed videos ever, because in an ocean of news about how nothing makes sense anymore, even a hint of order is highly desirable. Now, Money and Macro's video was actually very good, so I will forgive him for being a little bit bold with his thumbnail. After all, that's what YouTube is. But it does demonstrate the point. Technology has made the marketplace of ideas open to anybody, but that's also made attention a valuable commodity.
But again, at the same time, what he's talking about is there's like yes men. Well, if there's a lack of common sense and people don't fully understand the system at hand, that's how bad ideas can become so popular, because they're not thinking about the downstream consequences of what's happening. So even in the videos that become popular on YouTube and the economic analysis that becomes popular, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true and accurate and right. It could just sound right, but there could be some unknown variable that was not taken into consideration because everything on YouTube is framed in a specific way to fit the narrative that the video is trying to produce.
Better or worse, the best way to stand out from the noise is to stand out on ideas. Now, Yuri was using his powers for good, but there are plenty of other people willing to genuinely support bad ideas for a price. In fact, one multi-billion-dollar industry in particular has made it their entire operating model. Corporate consultants have been having their biggest years ever. During the pandemic, they couldn't grow.
Well, this year, corporate consulting companies are not going to be doing as well based off of Doge cuts and government cuts to projects that they're looking at. But overall, yeah, that's typically what happens is Fortune 500 companies, they hire a consulting company because CEO has an idea and he wants to run with it. So he hires out the consulting company to produce the data and results and then analysis that aligns with his idea so he can go ahead and go through with it. And then if it doesn't go according to plan, they can point to the consulting company who's like, oh, well, they had this data and they said it was a good idea. So that's why we ran with it. It's essentially a cover your ass.
Grow fast enough because companies and even entire governments wanted smart-looking MBA grads to tell them how to set up work-from-home functions, adapt to new market conditions, and manage the crisis itself. In the UK, a report revealed that 2,300 management consultants from 73 different companies were contracted to work on the government's test and trace system, with £375 million spent on consultancy for this project alone. That meant for just this one project, the UK government had hired more consultants than people who worked in their own Treasury department. We do exactly the same thing here back in the United States of political campaign donations. The only difference is our healthcare system is so disjointed that it's hard to get hard figures for the entire country. Right now, consulting firms are doing record business on integrating artificial intelligence into companies that can't figure it out for themselves. And of course, consulting firms are also billing thousands of hours to help companies deal with this trade war. In theory, consulting like this does have a role to play. Organizations are...
I think in terms of using consulting companies to figure out how to best combat the trade war, yeah, sure, you can spend money and maybe you get a few extra basis points of return because you hired them, or you can just plan for the worst and then try and find an optimal route, assuming the worst case scenario. And I think that would be better in the long term because a lot of corporations, especially publicly traded ones, are primarily concerned with profits and returns in the short term, in the quarter-over-quarter basis, not in the 5, 10, 20-year basis. So this is, again, a problem with the structure of the economy, which came about in the 70s and 80s.
Are probably only going to need to react to a once-in-a-generation pandemic.
Oh, and it came about because of consulting companies.
Once in a generation. AI systems can be set up by a team that comes in, gets it done, and then does it for the next company without requiring full-time positions. But it rarely actually happens like this. The best way to secure lots of billable hours as a consultant is to find out what management already wants to do, and then create a report on why that is the only logical solution. McKinsey
Exactly
has
what I
published
said.
multiple articles on why working remotely is the best way to increase company efficiency, and they have also posted multiple articles about why returning to the office is essential for companies.
I think that I did a video earlier. It was probably last year, and it was around I think it was a Pennsylvania study on return to work, and oftentimes return to work, return to office is just a power play by corporate executives. Again, corporate executives, they don't always have to be in the office. And you have to think about it from that perspective. Well, corporate executive might think, well, I work 80 hours a week and I have to go into the office. I have to do all this travel. So why can't my employees? Well, there's a gap in their thinking of, well, corporate executives are so focused on their career that they make those sacrifices. The average American does not live to work, they work to live. So that's why there's this dramatic pushback by a lot of employees. And when it comes down to it, I can't remember exactly, it was some Bureau of Labor Statistics report. The average employee is productive for about 2 hours and 53 minutes a day. So if you take that into consideration, the people that are working from home and not doing the pretending to work, and they're still, as long as they're producing that 2 hours and 53 minutes of productivity, they're still doing the equivalent amount of work of going into the office.
So no matter what, the company can just point to the article that agrees with the decision they have already made. Now that's just consulting. Bad ideas can take you much further than that. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how to use bad ideas for profit and career advancement. With enough power and money, finding support for bad ideas is extremely easy. You might have already heard the story.
Yeah, you can throw money at the problem. And honestly, at this point, a lot of the economy seems to be a pay-to-win system, essentially. So if you're born into a family that has more money or more connections, you're going to be able to become more successful. It's like, again, video games. A lot of people hate pay-to-win video games because it just seems unfair. Well, oftentimes that's the case with many people in the economy. It's pay-to-win. So if you're not born with those resources, it's extremely difficult, especially for the younger generations.
But it's extremely funny and worth repeating as the perfect example of working backwards from a solution. President Trump has been a longtime advocate of protectionist policies to preserve domestic businesses and capabilities.
The fact is that you don't have free trade. We think of it as free trade, but you right now don't have free trade. And I think a lot of people are tired of watching other countries ripping off the United States.
He has been speaking out about this for a long time before he was president. And hot take alert, he kind of has a point.
He's ideologically consistent. That's commendable in today's society where politicians often go by their polling numbers. Well, Trump is ideologically consistent in terms of the U.S. has been getting ripped off.
Globalization has been great for people with lots of money who could take advantage of new markets to sell their products into, global investment, and outsourced supply chains. But it wasn't as good for people who depended on their jobs that were getting outsourced. As someone who was born into wealth and stood to benefit directly from global markets and global investments into his businesses and properties, it could be argued that Trump's support for protections was purely altruistic. Now, maybe that's true, or maybe he just found a popular sounding message. You guys feel free to shout it out in the comments. Either way, identifying a problem is one thing.
I mean, he is a populist president, and populism is often something that many politicians can run on to get a lot more support. But again, it might not necessarily take into consideration the second and third order consequences because, again, not everybody is going to be fully educated on every single topic that a politician is talking about. And yes, politicians, they get access to additional information that could change their perspective and their opinion and might take into consideration some of the second and third order consequences. So that's where, you know, some politicians, they get elected based off of populist policies in their campaign, but then they get into the office and don't actually fulfill those promises because they do have to start to take into consideration those second and third order consequences. And a lot of those second and third order consequences that politicians are looking at is whether they can get reelected or not.
Working out a solution is the hard part, and the current architect of America's trade policy is an economist called Peter Navarro, who Trump first identified after his son-in-law found his book Death by China on Amazon. It's clearly an emotive title that vibes well with the idea that China is an enemy that must be crushed. Now, you are welcome to make up your own mind about the contents of the book. The documentary that is based off it is also available for free here on YouTube. So as always, I will leave a link to both of those down below. Now, even with the very heavy title, none of that by itself would be very interesting. Politicians rely on policy advisors all the time. But the only difference is, Navarro cited another economist called Ron Vara throughout his work who turned out to be completely made up. Ron Vara is just the letters in Navarro rearranged, so he wasn't even trying that hard. So yeah, some of the most impactful economic policies of the last century have been based on ideas supported by a man, supported by a book, supported by an apparition. It would be funny if so many people weren't going to lose their jobs over it. But it is a perfect example of how supporting contrarian ideas is a great way to get opportunities that level heads might not. Whether we like it or not, Peter Navarro and his imaginary friend are now some of the most influential economists in the world. There are only a handful of people in history that ever get to enact their policies on this scale, and he got that opportunity by supporting the right message. So yeah, next time senior management at your company has a questionable idea, make sure to get behind it wholeheartedly. It may hurt the business, but your resume will look great.
This is just, that advice right there is perpetuating the problem. And again, it's difficult because if you want to, be able to pay your bills and continue to live the life that you want, you're going to have to probably play some of that corporate politics and agree with things that you disagree with and foresee being a negative impact on the company or the economy as a whole. But without broad support of actually pushing back on ideas, then you're just going to get fired and replaced with the next yes man.
And that's the third and most important reason why bad ideas get so much support. Bad ideas aren't allowed to just be bad ideas anymore. One thing that cheered me up last week while watching my life savings take a little roller coaster ride was the tweets from people praising the stock market rally after telling their followers that the stock market didn't matter, after previously claiming that the stock market was the leading indication of a strong economy. Now obviously this hypocrisy—
well, the economy is not strong. Anybody that thinks the economy is strong is probably a politician or the Federal Reserve, and they have incentives to claim the economy is strong.
Was understandably criticized since most of this was just driven by partisanship. But it's also important people that can change their mind. The harder we make it for people to admit that they were wrong and reverse a harmful decision, the more likely they are to dig their heels in and overcommit to a bad idea.
And this is one of the things that Jeff Bezos talked about in his interview with Lex Friedman. He talked about his chief role at Amazon was chief slowdown officer, and, making fast decisions as long as they were reversible. But if it's an irreversible decision, then you take more time and make sure it's the right decision.
If you are managing people, this can be one of the most important skills to develop. You don't want people to take advantage of you, but you also don't want them to hide mistakes out of fear of reprisal. Now, government officials in the country's highest office should be held to a higher standard than subordinates, but there are a lot of factors that have made it extremely difficult for them to reverse bad decisions. Navarro, for example, has a PhD from Harvard, where his thesis was on the true motives behind corporate charities, something we have critiqued here on this very channel. But now he is probably only going to be known as the guy that made up an expert on trade disputes. Expanding outwards, even on trade protections themselves, are probably going to get a bad rep from this. There is a lot to be said in support of protecting local industries and making sure that average American workers aren't forced to make sacrifices just so multinational corporations remain competitive. However, any new protectionist proposals in the future are going to be challenged by people pointing out that it's just another tariff war, so why would we want to do that again? Smart people have bad ideas all the time. It doesn't mean that they are automatically wrong about everything.
Yeah, and again, what makes a bad idea is a lack of consideration of all the variables in the equation. So you have a gap. And when it comes to the global economy, there are so many variables that even if you think you understand the system and how it works, you're probably not considering every single variable. So your hypothesis, when you make a change on it, is not going to have the same end result that you necessarily intend.
And even if the solution to a problem is bad, it doesn't mean the problem no longer exists. But increasingly polarizing news and shortened attention spans means that this is probably going to happen more and more. So, how do you take advantage of this? Well, if you're going to support an idea in your own career, make sure you get behind it without being the face of it. Express support to your bosses, but do it quietly so you'll get all the rewards of being on board, but can't be used as a scapegoat when it inevitably all comes crashing down.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you have an idea or your boss has an idea and you think it's a good idea, get your boss's buy-in and then have them run the idea. That way you can't take the fall for it.
I really don't want to have to keep uncovering everything coming out of Washington. And I want to emphasize that we called out the last administration too. But on a channel that's made for highlighting dumb ideas in business, finance, and economics, it's hard to make a video about much else when these actions make everything irrelevant by comparison. I have put together a full collection of everything you need to know about the flip-flop trade war, so if you want to get up to speed, go and watch that next. And make sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.
I think this is a great video. I'm curious, what do you think? Please share your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. And if you made it this far into the video, you may as well like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.